Long before pioneers arrived believing they had found empty land, they were stepping into a world that already knew war, trade, ceremony, and survival. Before Montana was Montana, it was not silent. The wind moved through grass that had names. The rivers carried memory instead of maps. Every ridge, creek, and valley already belonged to a story older than the United States itself. This land was not waiting. It was already lived in. Long before settlers dreamed of homesteads, native nations moved across this country with purpose. The Crow followed the bison and measured distance by seasons, not miles. The Blackfeet guarded the northern plains with ferocity earned through generations of war. The Salish, Pandore, and Kootenai lived west of the mountains where water and timber shaped their lives. The Assiniboine and Cheyenne moved through the eastern plains where the horizon never ended. These were not wandering people without roots. They knew exactly where they were and why they were there. Montana's rivers were highways before wagons ever cut ruts into the soil. The Yellowstone, the Missouri, and the Milk carried trade long before they carried steamboats. Stone tools, hides, horses, and stories moved along these waters. Paths worn by moccasins became trails that settlers would later claim as discoveries. Nothing about this land was accidental. Then the horse arrived, and Montana changed forever. Before the horse, life moved at the speed of human feet and dogs pulling travois. After the horse, distance collapsed. Hunting became faster. War became deadlier. Power shifted between tribes. Montana became one of the greatest horse cultures on the continent. A good horse meant survival. A fast horse meant dominance. A stolen horse could start a war. The plains became a living chessboard. Tribes fought not out of chaos but strategy. Territory mattered because survival depended on it. Winter grazing grounds meant life. Losing them meant death. Every valley had meaning. Every mountain pass had been tested. By the time white explorers entered the region, Montana was already dangerous. Not wild, but defended. The first Europeans came for fur, not land. They built trading posts instead of towns. Places like Fort Union and Fort Benton became crossroads where cultures collided. Trade brought metal, guns, and alcohol. It also brought disease. Entire communities vanished before settlers ever saw them. Smallpox traveled faster than any army. It erased villages and broke power balances overnight. Survivors adapted. Grief hardened into resolve. The land did not empty itself. It was wounded. When American explorers finally arrived, they misunderstood what they were seeing. They called it wilderness. They called it empty. They called it free land. What they really saw was land shaped by centuries of human decision-making they did not recognize. Lewis and Clark passed through Montana and survived only because native people helped them. They mapped rivers, but not meaning. They recorded animals, but not ownership. Their journals did not mention the invisible borders everyone else respected. What could not be measured was ignored. As the United States expanded west, Montana became an idea before it became a place. It was a promise whispered to the desperate. Land for the landless, opportunity for the poor, freedom for those crushed by the East. What the promise never mentioned was who already lived there. When settlers finally came in numbers, they arrived believing history began with them. They built cabins on hunting grounds. They fenced migration routes. They plowed land that fed bison herds for generations. Each act felt small. Together, they were catastrophic. The bison were not just animals. They were food, shelter, tools, and spirituality. When the herds vanished, native life collapsed with them. Some tribes resisted. Some tried to adapt. All paid the price. Montana did not slide into settlement. It slammed into it. As gold was discovered, everything accelerated. Men poured in faster than law could follow. Mining camps appeared overnight. Native land was suddenly valuable in ways treaties could not protect. The government followed the miners. The army followed the government. War followed everyone. To settlers, Montana looked like opportunity. To native nations, it looked like invasion. Both were right. That truth made peace nearly impossible. The Blackfeet fought to protect the northern plains. The Crow tried to ally with the United States to survive their enemies. The Cheyenne and Lakota pushed west as pressure mounted from all sides. Montana became a crossroads of desperation and ambition. Treaties were signed and broken with alarming speed. Lines were drawn and erased just as quickly. Each agreement promised peace. Each one guaranteed future conflict. The land itself became a weapon. Winter killed the unprepared. Distance isolated the careless. Rivers flooded and froze without mercy. Those who survived learned quickly or not at all. By the time Montana became a territory, its future was already stained. Violence had shaped the ground beneath the settlements. Graves outnumbered laws. Stories outnumbered truths. What settlers called progress often meant removal. What they called peace often meant silence. Native nations were pushed onto reservations carved from what remained. Land that once fed thousands was reduced to boundaries enforced by soldiers. Still, native culture did not vanish. It endured. It adapted. It remembered. Montana's mountains still hold stories older than any town. Its rivers still follow paths chosen long before statehood. The land never forgot who it belonged to first. It only learned to live with the consequences. Before Montana was Montana, it was already complete. It had identity. It had history. It had conflict. Settlement did not create Montana. It transformed it, violently and permanently. Understanding Montana's Old West story means starting here. Not with wagons, not with gold, but with the people who knew this land when it had no name that settlers recognized. Because the greatest myth of the American West is not guns or outlaws. It is the lie that this land was ever empty. And Montana remembers.